The SA80 A1 is the story of an idea that made sense until the moment someone had to manufacture, deliver, and trust it. On the drawing board, it was almost too elegant to go wrong. Britain wanted a modern, compact rifle with a useful length barrel, optical sight, intermediate cartridge, futuristic appearance, and a unique solution to replace a somewhat antiquated combination of Cold War weapons. The result should be simple: less weight, less length, better control, plus a leap into the 1980s. What came out of this was one of the most embarrassing small arms programs of post-war Britain. Designed by committee, pressured by politics, manufactured under dubious quality control and handed out to soldiers who didn't exactly have the luxury of treating the weapon like an engineering thesis. The short sentence would be, the SA80 A1 was bad. The most useful phrase is, he was bad, in a way that explains a lot about how a good idea can rot inside an institution. And to be clear from the beginning, this is a story of engineering, adoption, manufacturing, and reputation. It is not a guide to use, purchase, modification, or operation. The interest here is in what the SA80 reveals about the British Ministry of Defence, national industry, NATO standardisation, and the stark difference between a promising design and a reliable system. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel. I'll repeat this because technical military history doesn't appear by accident. If you want more episodes with context, failure, factory, doctrine, and reputation, signing up needs to happen while the case is still clear. The starting point wasn't even absurd. In the late 1960s, the British Army still carried the L1A1, the British version of the FNFAL. He was respected, robust, reliable, and much loved by many people. So naturally it needed to be replaced. Jokes aside, it came from an earlier logic: long, heavy, in full power caliber, great for certain wars imagined in the 1950s, less elegant for an army that was beginning to think about mobility, vehicles, patrols, urban combat, and lighter ammunition. There was also Sterling, which covered part of the proximity and automatic fire needs. However, maintaining two solutions, two roles, and two ammunition logics was not exactly a logistical symphony. The dream was to bring everything together in one system, compact like a submachine gun, with a rifle barrel, fed by an intermediate cartridge, with a modern sight. The bullpup seemed to solve the equation. This is the part that a lot of lazy analysis ignores. Britain didn't just wake up one day and decide to do something ridiculous for sport. The bullpup had real logic. By placing the action and magazine behind the trigger, the gun could hold a long barrel within a shorter overall length. For an army looking at vehicles, trenches, buildings, helicopters, and infantry carrying more and more equipment, this seemed very attractive. In short, the compact package promised the performance of a rifle without the size of a military or. The problem is that Britain had already experienced a much more elegant version of this temptation decades earlier. In 1951, the EM2 almost became the British rifle of the future. Bullpup, advanced, with its own cartridge in .280, it seemed to have come out of a timeline in which the 1950s received a quick visit from the 1980s. But NATO standardization pushed the Western world to the 7.62mm, and the EM2 was left behind before it matured. A rational decision at the political level, perhaps. A small funeral for the British imagination, indeed. When the 1960s arrived, the story became more irritating. The United States, which had helped consolidate the logic of the 7.62mm, began moving towards the 5.56mm with the M16. Standardization, which had once crushed EM2, now seemed less sacred. Then Royal Enfield returned to the bullpup with the L64 and L65, using a British 4.85mm cartridge and internal architecture influenced by the AR-18. Again, there was a coherent idea: compact weapon, small caliber, better control, independent British future. Again, NATO entered the room. When the 5.56mm became the standardized path, the British design had to be adapted. And here begins the part where every memo should come with a warning: it seems simple because no one has tried to produce it at scale yet. The conversion seemed small. The British cartridge was close in concept, the design already existed, the objective was clear. All you had to do was adapt the project and move on. On the drawing board, of course. The drawing board is a very polite place. In practice, pressure, operating time, tolerances, heating, food, extraction, materials, factory and ammunition do not comply with meeting optimism. A rifle is not just an external form with changed parts. It's a set of small margins. Change one variable and another responds. Accelerate the agenda and the factory responds. Test cut and the field responds. And the field, unlike a report, responds with public humiliation. What followed was a perfectly British combination of technical ambition, political commitment and administrative embarrassment. The project was redesigned too quickly, with too many changes, by too many people, under too much pressure. The result began to look less like a patient evolution and more like an agreement between departments trying to get to the end of the meeting before anyone asked if it was really ready. Then came production. At first she stayed in Enfield. In 1988 it was moved to a new facility in Nottingham. New factory, new machines, new beginning. Great, except for the small detail that a new line is not automatically born competent. Part of the workforce did not have in-depth experience in manufacturing firearms to that standard, and quality control was as delicate as a door slamming in the wind. Reports and evaluations pointed to problems with weak springs, poor heat treatment, fragile parts, plastic components breaking, metal components breaking, charges deforming, covers opening, poor fittings and tolerances that seemed to have been negotiated with the enemy. Each isolated item could become an excuse. Together, they became a portrait. The weapon was being manufactured as if the reputation could be adjusted later. If this part has already changed your reading of the weapon, comment one word: project, factory, doctrine, policy, war, or reputation. Short commentary helps define which angles deserve further investigation. And there was an even worse part: several problems were already known before large-scale emission. This changes the story. It's not just the tale of an unlucky gun. It's the tale of an institution pushing risk down until it reached the person who could no longer return it to the committee. When a system fails testing, it is a technical problem. When it fails after ignored warnings, it becomes a moral problem. Even the acceptance criteria have their moment of theater. The mission standard used in testing was criticized for being too low, and certain interruptions did not register as failures if they could be resolved by the user in the field. It's a very creative way to transform reliability into vocabulary. If the car stops on the road, but you manage to get it moving again after a tiring ritual in the rain, technically it may not have broken down. Great news for the report. Bad news for those who needed to get home. In 1985, the L85 and L86 entered service as part of the SA80 family, small arms for the 80s. The name had enough confidence for a brochure. The L85 rifle would be the individual weapon. The L86, with a heavier barrel and bipod, would be the light section support. But the L86 carried a contradiction right from the start. It wanted to occupy a support role without being powered by tape and without having the same fire support logic that dedicated weapons offered. It was a kind of bipod compromise, and bipod compromises are still compromises. To be fair, the SA80 wasn't useless at all. The compact concept was real. The Suzat sight was, for the mid-1980s, an important advancement over common iron sights. Accuracy could be good. The idea of giving the British soldier standard optics was modern. There was a serious attempt to move towards a more equipped and visually sophisticated infantry. The problem is that the A1's history wasn't defined by what it did well on a controlled day. It was defined by what he did badly when the environment stopped cooperating. And then came the Gulf War in 1991. Nothing destroys an adoption myth like sand, heat, haste, and attentive correspondence. The conflict was brief, intense, and fought under conditions that the SA80 A1 zealously detested. The rifle gained a reputation for requiring constant cleaning to function properly and, at the same time, for suffering when conditions made such cleaning a fantasy. Lubrication and sand made a terrible partnership. Fragile components remained fragile. Charges and controls became a source of complaints. The troops didn't need an elegant theory about bullpups. I needed to trust the object I had received. The Lancet report, commissioned later, was devastating. He criticized the performance in the Gulf and the decision to accept the system into service. When military equipment becomes a national scandal, the institution usually tries to reduce the discussion to isolated cases, a difficult environment, or imperfect training. Sometimes this is part of the truth. In the case of the SA80 A1, it was increasingly difficult to pretend that the problem resided solely with the user. Quick break, sign up now. If this type of analysis without hype and without tutorial makes sense, follow the channel before the next case gets lost in the feed. The most curious thing is that the bullpup, the great promise, was not the only culprit. Yes, the format takes a toll. Charger behind the handle changes ergonomics. The trigger tends to suffer with longer calls. Controls may become less intuitive. Side ejection limits use by left-handers. The weight may be concentrated behind. These difficulties are known. But the SA80 A1 added to them a poor industrial debut, peculiar control decisions, troubled manufacturing, and an eroded reputation before it had a chance to defend itself. Here it is worth pausing to subscribe, because this is exactly the type of story that the channel needs to unravel, not the isolated technical sheet, nor the repeated meme, but the entire chain that transforms a project into a reputation. If you want more military adoption stories explained without propaganda and without a manual, this is a good time to follow the channel. The next chapter is almost cruel. Instead of replacing everything, the British government decided to fix it. Partly because throwing away an entire system would be expensive. Partly because it would be embarrassing. An embarrassment, in military acquisition, sometimes weighs almost as much as budget. The solution was to hire Heckler & Koch to rebuild what could be rebuilt. At the time, HK was owned by British Aerospace, a useful technicality to soften the image of a German company repairing a British rifle. The humor wrote itself, as rarely happens in public contracts. Between 2000 and 2006, around 200,000 weapons were reworked at a cost of approximately £92 million. The list of changes was long enough that revision seemed like a timid word. Many internal parts were replaced or redesigned, components were strengthened, power and reliability improved, and the A2 finally delivered something the A1 should have delivered from the beginning: acceptable military standard operation. This part is important because it prevents lazy conclusion. The SA80 was not a completely irretrievable idea. A2 showed that a lot could be saved. The platform, with enough rework, could work. But that also makes the A1 more embarrassing, not less. If the concept could be saved by serious engineering, the initial disaster looks even more like haste, politics, and poor manufacturing. But HK couldn't fix everything. I couldn't change the story. I couldn't erase years of jokes. It couldn't turn a straight bullpup into a fully ambidextrous weapon. I couldn't make the controls seem like the result of a single mind at rest. I couldn't make the L86 an ideal support weapon after years of trying to justify an awkward role. And I couldn't stop each subsequent improvement from being accompanied by the silent phrase, "Why wasn't this right before?" The A3 brought additional modernizations years later, with better tracks, new exterior configuration and updates to keep the system alive longer. The L86 was eventually retired. Specialist British units followed different paths, adopting modern AR pattern rifles in certain contexts. The Ministry of Defence started to discuss replacements with projects like Rayburn. The overall message was clear without needing to be cruel: the SA80 stayed, but the future didn't seem in love with it. And yet, the strangest fact is that he stayed for decades. A weapon with a disastrous start, terrible reputation, easy jokes and institutional trauma continued in service for an impressive service life. This doesn't happen because everyone secretly loved her. It happens because military systems create inertia. There's training, parts, contracts, inventories, workshops, doctrine, budget, politics, schedules, and the fear of admitting that the entire closet needs to be reorganized. This is a detail that the public tends to underestimate. Replacing a service weapon is not exchanging an object. It's changing a chain. A rifle comes with manuals, workshops, simulators, instructors, spares, ammunition stocks, optical mounts, bags, procedures, schedules, and institutional pride. Even a hated solution takes root. Sometimes the question isn't why did they keep doing it? The question is who had the budget, courage, and authorization to get rid of all this at once. Before you reach the end, sign up one more time if you haven't already. And leave in the comments which adoption, failure, or platform you want to see open later. The channel grows based on investigation, not object fetishism. The contrast with SA80 A1 is almost poetic. The old rifle was long, heavy, and stuck in an earlier era, but it had confidence. The SA80 promised modernity, but lost confidence early. In theory, trust should come after specification. In real life, specification only matters while trust still breathes. After the troops decide that a system has failed them, each small problem becomes confirmation of a sentence already given. That's why the SA80 A1 yields more than a list of defects. A list of defects becomes curiosity. The complete story becomes a diagnosis. A1 shows how a country with an industrial tradition and military experience can stumble when technology, international standardization, national pride, and political agenda come into the same room. It also shows that modern does not mean mature. Sometimes modern is just old with new problems and a more interesting aim. The dry humor here is not gratuitous mockery. It works because there is an administrative tragedy behind every joke. The compact weapon that weighed almost like the heavy weapon it would replace. The light support that didn't solve the support role very well. The system adopted despite known problems. The new factory that did not deliver the necessary consistency. The foreign repair of a national symbol. It's a comedy, as long as you weren't the person forced to trust the equipment. There's also a lesson on technical reputation. The A2 could be trusted. The A3 could be modern enough to continue. But the name SA80 already carried the shadow of the A1. Bad reputations are sticky. A system can truly improve and still be judged by its worst chapter. Especially when this worst chapter happened at the beginning, in front of those who needed to believe in him. If there is a possible defense of SA80, it needs to be honest. The compact concept had merit. Standard optics were advanced for the period. The accuracy was not negligible. The improved versions worked much better. The problem is that none of these points absolve A1. They just make the story more interesting. SA80 wasn't bad because the question was stupid. It was bad because a legitimate question received a rushed, irregularly fabricated response and pushed into service before being trusted. And perhaps this is the phrase that sums it all up: the SA80 A1 didn't just fail as an object, failed as a process. It failed when standardization changed the way. It failed when the adaptation was treated as too simple. It failed when production did not live up to its promise. It failed when tests and criteria seemed more interested in enabling adoption than preventing embarrassment. It failed when known problems reached the soldier as an official surprise. Coming to the end, last reminder, subscribe to the channel. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the type of viewer who understands that a famous weapon isn't just about specifications. It is an institutional decision with consequences. In the end, the reason he still fascinates is not because of the joke. It's the anatomy of the joke. The SA80 A1 became a symbol because it concentrated, in a single rifle, almost everything that can go wrong when an institution wants to appear modern before being ready for the cost of modernity. He was born to replace the past and ended up proving that the past, sometimes, at least worked. Later versions deserve a fairer analysis. The A2 and A3 are not the same disaster. But the A1 deserved the reputation it earned. Not because of an isolated failure, not because of a difficult environment, not because of the ill will of conservative soldiers. He deserved it because trust was broken early, repeatedly, and publicly. If you want more reviews like this, subscribe before you leave. It is not a channel about technical details for technical details. It's about what happens when design, factory, doctrine, and reputation conflict. So the question for the next video is not just which weapon was worse or better. It's which military program best shows the difference between a good idea, a bad adoption, and a reputation that never quite returns to normal. Because, when a system is born like this, engineering can fix a lot of things. Memory, not so much.